Well, I was wrong. Even though someone did go on an ultimately foolish and destructive quest for knowledge about the origin of life, one that was meant to parallel Frankenstein, in Issa Lopez's story, it was the indigenous woman rather than the white male scientists. Yes, it appears Annie was the one killed by the bear in a similar way to how I hypothesized the bear would lure the scientists in with the mystery of nature before killing them. I don't think any man is capable of snatching Annie like a rag doll so suddenly. Turns out Annie's killer was no man.
I am no man.
I really don't know how these other review channels don't see she was exploring the bear's maternal den in her phone video. As my girlfriend pointed out, Lund saying she's in the ice is referring to the bear's maternal den being inside an ice cavern, as we see in Annie's phone video. I think that after she's been dead a while, preserved by the freezing temperatures, Ray finds her and possibly moves her body away from the bear den. Ray and Annie may have encountered the bear or at least discussed it, so Ray would have some indication where she was at even if he hadn't yet found the den. He likely snaps for some reason. Maybe he introduced the bear to her and blames himself for her death, and chooses to take a grisly memento and her cell phone. This drawing in Ray's notes appears to be a highly stylized sketch of the ice cave. Sorry to Chuck for accusing him in my last video. You're an innocent man. But why was Chuck so worried about Navarro's digging into Annie's case? I think Annie's brother views it as shameful that she was sleeping around. Chuck likely was also having sex with Annie, and Chuck wants to keep his relationship with Annie secret from Annie's brother, with whom he's likely friends. And I think it's possible that Hank was motivated to keep it secret because he was cheating on Peter's mother with Annie as well. Even though Peter's mother is no longer in the picture, Hank would want to keep this secret from Peter. And this leads to a larger way I was wrong about the show. It doesn't appear as one-sidedly pro-female and anti-colonial as I initially thought. Annie's brother's shame for Annie's sexual liberation reflects the indigenous culture's view of the constricted roles of women, and Western influence is what has allowed Danvers and Annie to be sexually liberated. This is the cultural side of what is a kind of Humean distinction between culture and science. On the science side, Issa Lopez is much more pro-science than I initially thought. While there is a parallel to Frankenstein suggested, Lopez is flipping it to a female as the Dr. Frankenstein being undone through her inquiry into the origin of life.
I found it. It's here.
Of course, here, the bear's den is literally the origin of newly born cubs. This is a rejection of Frankenstein author Mary Shelley's positioning of inquiry and curiosity as an exclusively male quality, in spite of all of Lopez's scientists being men. But in addition to this, we have all of the ways that we see science and technology contribute to the case. Boy Wonder, aka Pete, uses his male affinity for technology to make important breakthroughs in the case, the unlocking of Annie's phone only being the most recent example. We also see the positive role of Western science and learning in Annie's resuscitation of the newborn. And that's not all. The mining company is even getting some love. Not only does it look like the mining company had nothing to do with Annie's death, but the fact that the mine provided the funding for the ice rink portrays the mine as providing a vitally important material resource that allows the case to be investigated. Without the ice rink, the corpuscle likely would not be able to be properly thawed. It's enough to make me wonder if the mine is actually not poisoning the water. That said, I think we'll see both good sides and bad sides to the mine's presence. Even Hank falling for an Eastern European mail-order bride is symbolic of the male role in bridging cultural divides, even if we are led by our
Yes.
The interracial relationships we see, particularly between Ray and Annie, as well as between Pete and his wife, are depicted in a very positive light. This is another positive portrayal of colonialism and the expanding inclusivity of Western culture. And while my misjudgment of Lopez's intentions may be my fault due to some cynicism over the hostility some other entertainment franchises have shown their male fan bases after being taken over by women,
I like to make men uncomfortable.
I think this actually doesn't give Issa Lopez enough credit. I think the reason we are getting so much man bad imagery and the suggestion that the mine is poisoning the water this early in the season here is that she purposefully is misleading the audience to think that we're going in a much more politically leftist direction than we actually are. She's in the middle of judo flipping us to make positive points about men and colonialism. Very much a Jedi mind trick. The scene with Oliver to go is a very good example of why I like to try to figure out where we are going with the plot. To many people, this scene is a complete letdown and waste of time. No information is exchanged on a literal level in the story. Tagao simply kicks out the police before saying anything. Lots of build-up, no payoff. To many people. But this was one of the most interesting scenes in the show for me. It very definitively flips Lopez's portrayal of colonialism. Lund is supposed to represent the whitest white guy to ever white with an extremely Scandinavian name. His status as the oldest member of the research group is setting up the members as representing the expanding sphere of men inside Western culture. First, what are sometimes called quote-unquote Aryans, represented in Lund, and then we have an Irish member with Ray, and I can't remember whether this younger member is Spanish or actually Latino, but this represents a widening Western culture sphere of inclusion. And what I thought was going to be a juvenile Animal House-like bastardization of indigenous rituals by the whitest white guy and his men's group, I now think is going to be portrayed as a much more respectful syncretization of indigenous culture and Western culture. This is because Tagao is likely the one that taught Lund about the spiral symbol. See, this lady lies to Navarro about the spiral symbol. Annie didn't make it up. It really is an indigenous cultural symbol, but the knowledge of the symbol is something that is only to be shared with trusted people, people accepted by the indigenous culture. And not only does this episode really pile it on with the deception themes, it also emphasizes that Navarro is not accepted by the local indigenous people.
What's that bitch doing here?
She also doesn't have knowledge of the indigenous culture that would tell her what the symbol means despite being part Inupiaq by blood.
Oh, you forgot, didn't you?
So it looks like we are still on course for the group of scientists to have died during an initiation ritual for an informal men's group, one interrupted by the bear. I think this ice fishing scene also foreshadows the ritual to involve a naked ice water swim, sometimes called a polar bear swim, which caused the men to try to get out of the ice, crabs in a bucket style. This is also a thematic reversal of the male-female roles in the deaths. While men are more often associated with inquiry and adventure, whereas Annie is the one who died while somewhat foolishly engaging in an adventurous inquiry, women are more often associated with spiritual cultural tradition, and the men will have died while somewhat foolishly engaging in a spiritual cultural tradition. The bear seems to be one example of negative motherhood, both directly in her murdering Annie and metaphorically as a representation of the threats of Mother Nature. And to return to Navarro and her lack of indigenous culture, this is another example we are seeing of a negative mother role. Navarro's mother's failure as a parent to Navarro is very evident. We also are seeing Danvers as a mixed portrayal, with her both shielding and guiding Pete in order to enhance his positive male qualities, but also some suggestion that Pete will ultimately have to rebel against her overbearing. I think Danvers and Pete's relationship is a little biblical reference to the idea that a man leaves his mother and clings to his wife. We will likely see Pete rejecting Danvers in favor of his wife in some way as a major plot development. I'm wondering if Pete actually decides to end the case in some way because he wants to spend more time with his family, reversing Danvers' somewhat impulsive but active choice to take the case on and placing a man in the passive female/circle-like role that Danvers' usual rejection of cases represents.
Send this thing back to Anchorage.
Thought that's what we were doing.
This suggests some negative aspect to mothering that has to be resisted by children. I think this bit with the returning orange may be a red herring intended to get theory types like myself or others on Reddit to invest more in the Dyatlov Pass avalanche theory and distract from the bear. The orange rolling downhill on an otherwise barely detectable slope is a good candidate explanation, although we may just chalk this up to hallucination weirdness. I still think it is mostly a red herring, and the men died with fright when encountering the bear, as the vet explained. But it is perhaps possible that the men accidentally triggering an avalanche is what directly woke up the bear. Of course, the availability of oranges in the Arctic is another potent symbol of the positive aspects of the male-coded colonialism, industry, and science. And so, despite this episode being widely criticized as a quote-unquote filler episode, it seems to represent a more full unveiling of the positive messages Lopez has about men and Western expansionism. And in doing so, it is a pivotal reversal of some of the negative messages the show has seemed to be heading for so far. Just to be clear, the season is still centered on a positive portrayal of women as mothers and facilitators of the intergenerational transmission of the positive aspects of masculinity. This episode just clarified Lopez's view on that positive masculinity. As always, if anything I said made you think, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. This has been Shiva's Right Foot, and I'll talk to you next time.
Stand by your man. Give him 2 arms to cling to, and something warm to come to when nights are cold and lonely.